Thanks very much. On behalf of York University Faculty of Grad Studies and the National Community of Practice on Grad Supervision, we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Stan Taylor to this national webinar focusing on graduate supervision. Dr. Taylor has worked with supervisors in over 50 institutions in the United Kingdom and in many others in Europe and the Far East. He has authored or co-authored numerous books and papers on doctoral supervision. In fact, his key text was seminal for the work that we've been able to do, not only at York University, but within the National Community of Practice here in Canada. He wrote the United Kingdom's Council for Graduate Education's Good Supervisory Practice Framework and led the development of its program for supervisor recognition. Many other accolades exist on his website. We invite you to look at that. He is a principal fellow of the Higher Education Academy and a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. With that, Dr. Taylor, we're going to stop sharing our slides, invite you to start sharing, and we welcome you to this space. And thank you for coming and speaking.
Well, hopefully, you should have my slide there.
Perfect.
Just check that's great. Okay. Well, thank you. If I can, first of all, thank you very much indeed for the invitation, which is very kind and very generous. I'm Stan Taylor. My background, just to give you something there, in terms of education and roles. And I have a very long-standing interest in doctoral education, which goes back to my own experiences as a research student many years ago, when I had a supervisor who had a laissez-faire philosophy of supervision. Unfortunately, I was a first-generation student, and I needed a bit more than that. So it turned out being quite a traumatic experience. Nevertheless, I survived it. I got an academic post. And at the end of my first year, I returned from annual leave. And my head of department said, Stan, you've got your first research student. And my face must have dropped. He said, well, what's the problem? And I said, well, I've no model to follow from my own supervisor. In those days, there was nothing in the way of professional development, very little in the way of literature. So it was a question of learning on the job, which wasn't very good for me, but much more importantly, it wasn't very good for my research students. So when I switched into academic development, I decided to work with supervisors. And as has already been said, I've worked with a number in the UK. I've also worked closely with the UK Council for Graduate Education on various initiatives. I've got some research and publications in the field. These are a number of papers, book chapters and things that have been published in the last few years. And there are 4 books. The one on the left, The Making of Doctoral Supervisors, is a study of how doctoral supervisors are supported, rewarded and recognised in 20 countries across the globe, one of which I'm pleased to say is Canada. That was published in 2021. The second one, Doctoral Examination, Exploring Practice Across the Globe, is a look again at 20 countries and about how they examine the doctrine. Huge differences between them. That was 2024. 2025, the 3rd edition of the Handbook for Doctoral Supervisors, which I wrote with Margaret Kiley from Australian National University. And then also last year, that one came out, the final one. That's a study of doctoral education, its development in 14 different countries. Well, that's more than enough about me. So if I can get on to the topic and to talk about today, which is supervisor professionalization and recognition. And what I'd like to try to do is to outline the background to the professionalization of research supervision and to look at how institutions can support supervisors to develop and enhance their supervision. And in terms of the objectives, I want to look briefly at the traditional model of doctoral supervision, the Humboldtian model, spend quite a lot of time outlining how recent developments have transformed doctoral education and in the process transformed doctoral supervision, and then to look at examples of how institutions are going about supporting supervisors to develop and enhance their provision. And in terms of the timetable, I'm hoping to get that first main part done in about 45 minutes. And hopefully leave enough time at the end there for questions before we close. And I will close at 1:30 because I know have other commitments. So if I can launch into it from there, let me just start with the Humboldtian model. Doctors, they go back at least to medieval times. Many would argue they go back to the 9th century Islam, but certainly in the medieval period, they were primarily licenses to teach and practice in the higher faculties of universities, and they were named according to their specialism: doctors of laws, medicine, theology, etc. The modern research doctorates usually dated to the foundation of the University of Berlin in 1810. That became the world's first explicitly research-led university, and one of the concomitants of that academic staff were to be trained by completing a new doctorate, which just be awarded for an original contribution to knowledge and understanding in the discipline. And to distinguish it from the older doctorates in their professional capacities, the newer one was awarded in Die Mutter aller Wissenschaften, the mother of all sciences, which was philosophy. So the DPhil, or it suddenly became the PhD, it was intended for a handful of the brightest and the best who would become the next generation of academics. It was based on a master apprentice model of delivery, with doctoral supervisors cast as experts, passively transmitting expertise to novices who observed and emulated. You'll see there is a quote there. I'll also, as well as the slides, I will send a bibliography with all the references I'm going to use in this presentation. So you'll be able to see that as well. In those days, the only qualification to be a research supervisor was to be research active, as the way in which earliest UK study put it. The assumption was if one can do research, then one can presumably supervise it, i.e., no other knowledge and skills were required. Supervision was, as Chris Park has put it, viewed as a secret garden, an activity that took place behind closed doors between consenting adults. Candidate had to complete the research project, write it up as a thesis, and defend it at an oral examination. And then, because it involved the creation of new knowledge, completion took as long as it took. The assumption was you couldn't create new knowledge to order. That very briefly, the Humboldtian doctorate, that's a doctorate that spread across the globe during the 19th century. In Canada, the first was awarded by the University of Toronto in 1900. The first by McGill was awarded in 1909. It might just be worth saying that these were well in advance of the first in the UK, which was awarded by Oxford in 1920. But that doctorate spread entirely across the globe, and in its essentials, it remained virtually intact until the third quarter of the 20th century. What has happened since then is there have been a huge number of changes in doctoral education, which, using a classification devised by an Australian study by Hammond et al., I've put into 4 clusters. The formalization of doctoral education, the growth, diversification, and welfare of the population, diversification of modes of study, and diversification of purposes. And what I would like to do now is to run through these broad categories under various subheadings and try to relate the changes to what's happening in terms of supervision. So if we start with formalization, we've got 4 processes ongoing there, which I've described as consumerization, McDonaldization, collectivization, and collaboration. So let us start with consumerization. The original model, as we said before, was master-apprentice, which is not a consumer relationship. But under the pressures of neoliberal governments over the past 30, 40 years, there's been a shift towards a much more producer customer focus in graduate education. And that's led to the quote there from Baslich and McCulloch, that customer expectations regarding the quality of engagement with the supervisor are exceedingly high. And in many countries now, graduate students have got legal rights, and they are pursuing those legal rights. When things went wrong, instead of blaming themselves, they now ring an appropriate bunch of lawyers. Canada is somewhat different. Traditionally, the courts in Canada have not been willing to countenance student complaints about supervision because the dominant legal ethos has been disputes of any kind of academic nature were deemed out of their jurisdiction, and that was within the jurisdiction of the university visitor. But certainly in one province in Ontario, it was partially overturned following a law case back in 2010. I'll leave you to read that account of that case there. So she had a neglectful supervisor. The university's defense was that the court did not have the jurisdiction to intervene in academic matters. What happened in that landmark case was the court disagreed with the university, say it did not lack jurisdiction solely because of a breach of contract arising in the nature of an academic dispute. And there's then some legalese, which essentially mean that the court decided it has the jurisdiction to rule on the claim and awards damages. So the current position is that in Ontario, graduate students dissatisfied with the quality of their supervision may, subject to certain conditions, sue for breach of contract. And obviously, Canada is very much a devolved system. We look at other provinces. There was a paper by Wong published last year, which suggests that the legal position is different in other provinces. So it might be possible to mount a case in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, but it would not be in British Columbia and Alberta. But as I said, that's in contrast to many other countries in the world where these rights have now become entrenched. The second trend under this heading is that of McDonaldization. What I mean by that is the philosophy of get them in, get them through, and get them out. Historically, there's a quote there from Renee Simpson. As long as they paid their fees and fulfilled the minimum residence requirements, nobody worried about how long they took, or indeed whether they ever finished in the first place. And then in the 1980s, governments across the globe began collecting statistics on completion rates and times. And it's really quite interesting that studies in Western Europe, the States, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand found that only half students completed at all. And of those, a relatively few completed within 3 or 4 years. And this triggered a whole set of responses across the globe. In the UK, our research councils began setting targets for completion, and if departments missed those targets, they got less, in this case, than 75% through within 4 years. They lost their funding for research studentships for 2 years. In Australia, it was much more severe. The system they introduced was you only got paid for your research students after they finished. So if your student took 5 or 6 years, you didn't get the money until they actually completed, and then you only got 4 years worth of money. So Canada, there were some restrictive measures. Individual universities adopted policies limiting the duration of doctoral studies. I've seen 2, one for Toronto, one the University of Alberta, saying 6 years or that's it. And the other thing I noticed was that in 2012, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council introduced a 3-year limit on funding. So the chopping of time has implications for supervisors, and there's some quotes here from a study of the issues that poses, which I'll leave you to read. I've seen the heartache of that final case where one student needed more time, they ran out of time, and essentially what the department did was they put the student in the full knowledge that the thesis would be would be referred for major revisions, which is heartbreaking to have to do, but it's one of the consequences of that. The third big change is in terms of regulation. Traditionally, I said before, research supervision was seen, it was a secret garden. That's the imagery in which the candidate and the supervisor work closely together without a great deal of external scrutiny or accountability. However, in recent years, and there's a quote there from policymakers, so as doctoral educations come to be increasingly seen in terms of a commercial and economic justification, there's been a lot more in the way of regulation. So what you've got globally, you've got national, Canada's case, provincial quality assurance systems for higher education, including doctoral education. You have external monitoring of the quality of education, and in response, universities have had to develop internal systems for the quality assurance of doctoral education. So an example here from Canada, Ontario universities, you've got the Council on Quality Assurance, and in response to that, the University of Toronto has developed its own internal quality assurance processes, which cover graduate degrees as well. And, excuse me, for these reasons, supervisors are now expected to be familiar with the complex administration, the regulation of doctoral programs, the documentation, the expectation, codes of practice, handbooks, policies, progression criteria, etc., etc. The next change under this heading is that of collectivization. Historically, the model was a single supervisor working with a research degree candidate, which has got the advantages of a single line of responsibility and source of support and guidance for the candidate. But you then got risks if one person is negligent, or if the relationship doesn't work, or if something happens to the supervisor. And there's been a move towards team supervision, and it's been global. There's a quote there from a recent book by Kumar and Wald. Team supervision has got advantages, but it also can lead to difficulties. I've just tried to illustrate this by this cartoon from Piled Higher and Deeper. And of your thesis committee, and I suppose the two key actors here are your professor, simultaneously your biggest ally and your worst enemy, and then the adversary. And the bitter rival, your professor, will argue the exact opposite. There can be a lot of issues involved in supervision. And for supervisors, it then creates the problem of managing co-supervisors as well as relationships with candidates. The other thing is that, again, this is much more recent. Supervision is moving towards a network system. In addition to the actual supervisors, the network system, you've got research group, you've got peer support, follow-up groups, international networks, external supervisors, and experts as part of a broader supervisory team. And again, that creates issues in terms of managing that wider network. The saying is it takes a village to create a PhD, and in part, the supervisor is responsible for managing that village. Another area which has changed dramatically is in terms of collaboration. Traditionally, doctoral studies took place within a single institution and were governed by a single set of policies and procedures. But in recent years, there have been moves, particularly from research funders and from government, to establish consortia of institutions to deliver doctoral studies. Like three types here. Intersectoral collaboration, that's collaboration between higher education institutions. Just one example I picked out here from Canada, the joint PhD in educational studies offered by Brock, Lakehead Universities and the University of Windsor. So what you now have is, instead of supervisors dealing with the rules, regulations and systems of one institution, in cases like this, they're dealing with the rules, etc., of three institutions, again, which complicates life. The second form of collaboration is intersectoral collaboration. And this is very much the mood of the moment. We're being encouraged to create PhD studentships with commerce industry, the public sector, the not-for-profit sector, etc., etc. Which is fine in itself, but you've got an example there. This is the McMaster's Flexible Industrial PhD program. Enables students to remain their own company, use their labs to complete their research and eventual thesis. That's fine in itself. It can create issues, though, in terms of supervision, because you have an academic supervisor and you have an industrial supervisor, and the priorities of the two of them can be very different. I mean, bluntly, the academic supervisor, his priorities is in terms of producing a piece of work which is published in academic journals, etc., etc. The industry supervisor's interest can be in getting results as fast as possible, getting them out and getting them implemented. You can have all sorts of clashes involved in that. And again, it's a much more difficult job for supervisors to manage. And then the third one is international collaboration. And I've got an example here from the Algant consortium of 9 universities, actually on 3 continents, including University of Bordeaux, Concordia in Canada, Germany, Netherlands, Italy, France, and so on and so forth. Offers a 2-year world-class integrated master's course and a joint doctoral program. Fine, but you then, if you're dealing with large numbers of institutions in other countries, you're also dealing with other cultures, and you've got issues to sort out. So, for example, in Germany, the examination of the chief examiner for a doctorate is the supervisor. Now, that's not allowed in many other countries. Supervisors are not allowed to play any part in the examination of the doctorate. So the problem is, how do you actually square this? How do you make the arrangements? How do you select examiners, etc.? It can make it very, very difficult. It's much more complex. That's the first set. The second set, the growth, diversification, and obligation for the candidate population. 4 processes here: massification, internationalization, diversification, and obligation. So if we can start then with massification, there's been a huge increase in the numbers of doctoral candidates over the 21st century. And I've got some figures here drawn from UNESCO and the OECD, looking at the percentage increases. This is between 2000 and 2017. And as you can see there, in the case of Canada, you're looking at about a 250, 260% increase in the numbers of doctoral candidates over that period. It's in the middle of the range. It's not as like China, where 450%, Mexico, similar figures, etc., etc. Or the UK is much less, but that's the figure for Canada. The causes of that include expansion of undergraduate master's degrees and the enhanced cachet of the doctorate. If everybody else has got a master's, then the doctorate gives you that extra cachet. Something I'll come to in a minute, the demands of the knowledge economy, and something else in a minute, the growth of recruitment for international candidates. The point is, there are now many more research candidates to supervise per supervisor, and that involves learning new techniques like, for example, group supervision in order to be effective in that role. The next thing is internationalization. There is nothing new in internationalization. I've got examples here of 4 scholars who've studied internationally. I wondered if anybody might know whom they are. Does anyone know who the guy on the left there is? He studied at 4 European universities in the 16th century. No? That's it.
Erasmus, someone said
Erasmus it is. Well done. Well done. That's great. Thank you, Guinevere. It is Erasmus, yes. This one here, anyone know? This is probably more familiar. Yeah, yeah.
Mention Marie Curie.
Marie Sklodowska-Curie. We have to include that Polish name as well. She was educated privately in Warsaw because at that time Poland was part of the Russian Empire and women were not allowed education. And then, of course, she moved to France and she became the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, and so far the only person of either gender to win Nobel Prizes in both physics and chemistry. This guy here, anyone know this? Probably the most famous philosopher of the 20th century. No? Okay, it's Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was born in Vienna, in Austria, did his first degree in engineering at the University of Munich in Germany. He then moved to Manchester University in the UK, and he worked on propellers for aircraft, at the end of which he developed an interest in philosophy and moved to Cambridge. And eventually he became a professor at Cambridge, where he didn't write. His doctoral thesis was the Tractatus, which is probably among the most influential doctrines of that time. You know this guy here, don't you? That's your Prime Minister, Mark Carney, obviously. And my reason for mentioning him is he did a DPhil in economics at my old college, Nuffield College, in Oxford, about 30 years ago. So there's a long history of it, but there's been a huge quantitative change over the first 2 decades of the 21st century, with a movement predominantly from the southern to the northern hemisphere. And in the southern hemisphere, you've had a massive expansion of undergraduate education, huge capacity constraints on postgraduate education, in particular, a shortage of people with PhDs and hence of supervisors. And then, again, some will cover more in a bit, the desire to develop knowledge economies. So there's been a track to the northern hemisphere because of the historical reputation for research and innovation, the greater research capacity, the richer research resources. And then at the end of the day, it's worth mentioning the financial needs of higher education institutions. It's certainly in the UK, an awful lot of institutions have used this as international students as a means of increasing their income. And so what's happened is that if you look at the percentage of doctoral graduates who are from outside the country in which they gain their PhD, it's quite amazing. I mean, in Switzerland there it's 55%, New Zealand it's half, and so the merry game goes on there as well. Canada is not included in that series. I don't know why, but it isn't. But when I checked, the data suggests that in Canada in 2022, 64% of doctoral graduates were Canadian, 36% were from other countries. And that can create issues for supervisors because of, there's a quote there from Prue Holmes. It's important to note that the direction may be changing for with the rotation now being within the Southern Hemisphere. The emergence of research capacity and capability among previous sending countries, including China and India. I mean, China had 96,000 doctoral graduates last year, which is nearly twice that of the United States, 4 times that of the UK. The movement of these countries and others, including Egypt, Malaysia, and even Russia, into the international student market. The international students are going there because they're offering more scholarships and significantly lower living costs. And then the final thing we're going to mention it is the rise of populist nationalism in the traditional host countries, including Canada and including the UK, so that fewer international students are allowed to enter and that those who do enter may feel unwelcome. So this dynamic seems to be changing quite rapidly at the moment. The next item here under this heading is the diversification of the candidate population. Historically, there's a description there of the traditional doctoral candidate. What has happened over the past 2 decades is that there has been a huge change in the composition of the candidate population. You can see it most clearly in gender. Now, if you go to the start of this century, you'll find around 1 in 5 doctoral candidates were female. As at the present time, certainly in the Western world, in nearly all cases, females are in the majority among the doctoral candidate population. There's been much less spectacular change, but some change in terms of the representation of ethnic and racial minorities, in terms of students with disabilities, in terms of students with different kinds of sexualities as well. So the composition has changed dramatically. And again, that's posed an issue for supervisor, which has been, I think, brilliantly described by Alison Yateman there. We need to be aware of those. I love this phrase of not being invited to imagine themselves as subject of genius. Another and rather more recent development has been in terms of obligation. Traditionally, doctoral candidates seen by many institutions, they are adults and as such responsible for their own well-being and their own mental health. But recent international evidence, there is a raft of studies going back to 2017, suggests that doctoral candidates suffer disproportionately from low levels of well-being, mental distress, the lower things, and then mental illness. The causes are complex. There are three in the literature. One is that because of the expansion of the undergraduate population to include students with pre-existing issues, that's impacted the graduate population as well. The second, and in a sense, the more concerning one, is it's the pressures of doctoral level work, the loneliness, the boredom, the sometimes difficult relationships with supervisors, the financial problems that are involved, and at the end of the day, you get your doctorate, so the career uncertainties because of the precarity of academic careers. So, the third one is that these two are interacting with each other, that the prior is being influenced by the present. So what's happened is over the globe that institutions are now seeing having a duty of care for the welfare and the mental health of doctoral candidates, and that has impacted supervisors. Is a quote here just to indicate why. Certainly in my work with supervisors, the main concern they have is what do we do if there are these signs of distress? How do we spot what are the signs of distress and what do we do in that particular case? That's become a real cause célèbre among supervisors. Pardon me. The third key area is diversification of modes of studies. Three things here: casualization, digitalization, dislocation. We start with casualization. What I mean by that is the growth of part-time students. Now, again, it's worth saying that part-time students have been around for a long time. This guy here was a part-time student. Does anyone recognize who he was? Indeed, indeed. Well done. Yes, it was Albert Einstein. He originally had a 3-year studentship at the University of Zurich, I think it was, and he wrote a PhD thesis and he put it in, and it was turned down as inadequate. He got a further year's funding and turned in a development of that thesis, which was also turned down as inadequate. At which point the funding ran out, and he got a job in the patent office in Bern. While in the patent office, he wrote another PhD thesis on an entirely different topic, put that in, and it was turned down on the grounds, quote, it was too long. His proud boast was that he removed one word from it, put it back in, and at the fourth attempt, he got his doctorate. You can read that paper. It's in the Annals of Physics for 1906. The deceptive title is On Brownian Motion, and its huge achievement was, for the first time empirically, it proved the existence of atoms. Now, that's just an example. These have been around for a long time. What's happened in recent years, I think in part because of funding constraints, is that people have been delaying entering doctoral education until later in life, and they're doing it while they're working part-time. And this creates all sorts of complications for them, and in the process, all sorts of complications for their supervisors. In terms of coping with the demands of employment, with demands of families and all the rest of it, and so on and so forth, it really does become a different ball game. So that's that casualization. Other thing we've hit is in digitalization. Familiar stuff here: the use of online tools to research information, ways of managing and storing content, new ways of analyzing data, opportunities to gain informal learning, and then communications between supervisors and candidates, etc. All these things are things supervisors have had to get on top of. Now, of course, we've got something else to get on top of, which is generative AI, which can yield major benefits in terms of access to sources of information, data analysis, etc. But it also has, I think, the unprecedented capacity to at least mimic the process of human creation to generate new material. I'd introduced what Butson and Rachel Smolkin-Smith, I think, have described as a Pandora's box of ethical complexities into doctoral education, in terms of doing and producing work which can then potentially be passed off as the candidate's own. And there is now a need for supervisors to manage the uses and abuses of AIs. And I think next to mental health, that's the issue that comes up in my work with supervisors. So now, as Josephson has argued, I'll leave you to read that. And in the final element of this one, diversification of modes in terms of dislocation, in terms of essentially supervision at a distance. I was always amazed prior to the COVID outbreak to be told it wasn't possible either to supervise or to examine at a distance. Within 3 weeks of the COVID outbreak starting, my colleagues were cheerfully supervising and examining over the net. The point was, it's not the same as doing it face to face. There is another skill set involved in terms of communicating candidates, in terms of motivating them, in terms of staying in touch, in terms of how you give feedback. There's all new sets of skills that have to be learned there. There are a number of guides that have been published to supervising online. And then my final category is diversification of purposes. And there are 4 elements there: cross-fertilization, proliferation, utilization, capitalization. Cross-fertilization is interdisciplinarity. And again, there's a quote there from a recent paper by Rana et al. It's wonderful, but the problem is, given that most of us have been brought up in disciplinary silos, interdisciplinary research can be very, very difficult. I perhaps give you an example here of a student working in the realm of nudge theory, the idea that you can get people to make fairly small changes in their lifestyles, behavior, whatever else it might be, which lead to major consequences. And this is relevant in both psychology and in economics. And a student of whom I'm aware had 2 supervisors, one from economics, who was from the mathematical end of economics, the other from psychology, and she was from the biological end of psychology. And there was no common language between the 2 supervisors, which made the whole situation very, very difficult for both of them. And eventually, they had to evolve a common language, but it involved so much extra work doing that and taking the student through to a successful conclusion. So interdisciplinarity. And then there is proliferation. Um, the PhD was dominant as a research degree for most of the 20th century. There were professional doctorates, a few of them around. But what's happened, it really, I think, in the past 20, 30 years, is there's been a kind of explosion in professional doctorates. And I've got a list there from Canadian sources, popular professional doctorates: pharmacy, medicine, ministry, psychology, veterinary medicine, nursing practice, etc., etc., etc. The point about these is that those doing these kinds of doctorates are usually mid-career professionals supervising them. It can be very, very different to supervising younger graduate students, and their expectations can be very much higher than those. And at the end of the day, there's the question of, do we really understand the professions that they're actually trying to work within or enhance? There's that. And then the other thing is doctorates by contemporaneous publication, which again, very much flavor of the month at the moment, whereby instead of writing a thesis, you put maybe 2, 3 papers published in peer-reviewed journals. You top it and tail it with introduction and conclusion, and that becomes your thesis. Huge advantage for that. You get peer review throughout what you're doing. You end up with publication. So if you want an academic career, you've got some basis for going forward. But for a supervisor, it can be a complete nightmare because you've got trained students to write for particular journals. You've got to help them, support them through what can be the very difficult process of publication in terms of rejection or in terms of demands for change, or in terms of a sheer length of time before their paper can actually be put out and so on. It's a nightmare, or can be a nightmare, for supervisors. So proliferation has added to the complexities of the job. The next thing, utilization. Historically, the dominant paradigm of research, we pursued knowledge for its own sake, but increasingly globally, the focus is becoming the pursuit of so-called useful knowledge, which can be applied to economic, societal, environmental problems. And that's reflected very much in the impact agenda, where the potential utility of research has to be demonstrated as a condition of funding. So what's happening is that supervisors are, in a sense, being forced to look at the application of what can be done in an applied sense by the candidates they're supervising. And then this, the final category here is that of capitalization. Traditional purpose was to train academic researchers, but from the 1990s onwards, the increase in doctoral graduates has way outpaced the increase in the numbers of academic posts. And I've got a quote here from the Council of Canadian Academies. I'll leave you to read that. So you're producing 8,000 new doctorates a year, but the academic population is remaining relatively constant. And the result of that is, if you look at the percentage of PhD graduates in tenure track posts, this is from two sources, an article and again the Council of Canadian Academies. So as you can see, in Canada, 19% of doctoral graduates in 2019 were in posts that were leading to tenure track, compared to 25% in the US, 34% in Switzerland. Just for the sake of it, that 19% is the same as in the UK as well. Roughly 1 in 5 will be in a tenure track post too. So the question then becomes, if the doctor is not about training academics, why? Why are we doing it if they're not jobs for them? And what's happened is the purpose has been redefined in terms of producing human capital for the knowledge economies. So knowledge economies, there's a description there of that and a link to PhD production. Now, because of that link, the PhD itself was changed. I've actually included a quote from myself here. So, in a nutshell, the traditional PhD was about producing academics. The new knowledge economy required research entrepreneurs. And the problem for supervisors is we are expected to contribute towards those research entrepreneurs. And one of those ways is through the development by them of the transversal skills, which will enable them to find employment, to thrive in employment outside academia. And here you've got, this is from the Canadian Association of Graduate Students Task Force, about the skills they're now expected to acquire in the process of doing doctorates. It's not necessarily up to supervisors to impart those skills directly, but it is important that supervisors have to flag those skills up and ensure that graduates or that candidates have the opportunity to develop them. So at the end of that rushed set, well, overall, a quote here from a recent paper by Sonia Cardoso. And what I've done here is I've tried to summarize everything that's gone before. So you will get a copy of, and it's a hugely busy, complex slide. You will get a copy of it. Essentially, what it has got there is in the first column, you've got the various categories that we set out. In the second column, you've got the old Humboldtian doctorate and a summary of what happened there. In the third column, you've got the forces that are driving change in the doctoral education. And then in the final column, you've got the things that are driving change in terms of doctoral supervision. After that, I think it's appropriate to stop for a minute and see if you have any questions.
Thanks, Dan. We actually have a couple,
Good,
if that works for you.
it does.
Okay. We have one where I'm looking for a bit of your advice, given all the supervisors that you've talked to over your career, the books you've written, the research that you've done. And it's really about when a student has been really struggling with a supervisor, it's not going well. When the student sort of wants to begin to self-advocate and is really not getting the response that they want, and possibly feeling maybe targeted now, or just it's not a healthy environment. I know it's a bit sort of outside what you've talked about, but it's really important to one of our guests. And I wondered if you might sort of speak a little bit about that, however you'd like to take that up.
It's interesting actually because I'm just finished literally this morning gathering data in the UK about how institutions approach that exact type of problem.
Mhm.
And what I can say is that I think best practice is for the student always to have a completely independent source of advice from the supervisory team. In other words, not somebody from the same department as a supervisory team, to have somebody with that advice. And then secondly, and I think of institutions in the UK, there's 149 with doctorates. I think 5 have it, which is to have arrangements for mediation
Mm,
so that a student with that issue can go to somebody, explain the problem, and somebody will establish a system of mediation
mm,
so that they can resolve the whole thing in an adult way
mhm.
between the student, the supervisor, the mediator, and the independent person.
Hmm.
But as I say, very few, I was actually quite shocked. Very few institutions in the UK have what I would regard as sensible arrangements for dealing with that type of issue.
Hmm. Is this your last slide? Because if it is, I'll get you to stop sharing just so we can see more of you. Unless
Well,
there's.
I'm going to go on and
Oh,
just
okay, wait. Okay, then I've got
no,
another good question.
I'll just I may just get a bit more light in. That's
Yeah.
better.
Um,
Okay, can I go
so
on? Or do you want me to? Is another question?
I have another one just for now
Okay.
because it sort of links back to you mentioned you were talking a little bit about what some folks call group supervision, some people call it co-supervision, and in Canada we're really looking at co-supervision in a few venues. I wondered if you might speak about what good co-supervision might look like in your experience, and then of course go ahead with your slides.
Um, I just say, I mean, with co-supervision, it involves more than one supervisor.
Yeah.
Um, that's different to group supervision.
Yeah.
Group supervision is where you can have one or more than one supervisor, but supervising students collectively. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Okay.
instead of just having one to one or whatever, you might have one to four or five.
Okay.
Um, Co-supervision is where I say where you have a number of supervisors supervising there. In terms of good practice, if I can just recommend, there is a book by Vijay Kumar. Um, I'm trying to think the co-author. It will come to me in a minute.
Okay.
Which is looking at co-supervision globally, which has
Okay.
got lots of advice in terms of both the dangers and in terms of good practice.
Thank you.
And there is another book by a lady called Margaret Robertson, who's an Australian academic, looking at models of supervision. And again, I can send you the reference there
Nice.
as well, looking at the good models and at the issues, the kind of issues can go on. She actually did her own PhD on this, which is
Hmm.
there. So
Okay, lovely. Please continue. Thank you.
okay, thank you. Right. Well, what I want to do now is to look at the professionalization of supervision. Um, what these changes have meant, there's a quote there from Griffith and Warren. And that's been recognised by supervisors themselves. This is a survey that was done a few years ago by Holson Malfoy, and this is a summary of what they found. So all supervisors in their sample conceptualised their current work as significantly different, actively fashioning students' developments to address deficits in expertise, deliberately intervening to ensure timely completion, providing tutoring or research assistance to minimize the risk of financial distress or withdrawal, and the deployment of personal networks to facilitate completion and ensure postgraduate employment. And you can see the way in which that's impacted supervisors. In the UK, we've had a survey of research supervisors, which was we've had 2021 and 2024. And they were asked the question, has doctoral supervision become more demanding over the past 5 years? And interesting, 71% of them thought it had become more demanding. Only 11% disagreed, 18% neutral there as well. Um, I don't know. I haven't seen a comparable survey for Canada. I just the only evidence I can quote there, but I'm sure many of you will feel that way. Um, and certainly, again, this is in the UK, that the increasing complexity of doctoral supervision has not necessarily been recognised by institutions. So that same survey asked, how much is research supervision valued by your workplace institution? As you can see, just over half thought that it was valued, but that's the worrying figure. 40% thought that it wasn't valued. And that lack of support by institutions can be difficult. This is a quote from Bastelix and McCulloch's, a recent Australian study. That's really important. Supervisors give themselves do not so because the institution will reward them, but because they care. And I mean, I've found that true virtually over much of the globe. Uh, in terms of my work, there's not that support, and it can be very demoralizing. This is actually from a supervisor from a university in the United States. I had a piece published in a paper, and I got a lot of email responses. This was one of them. So the question then becomes, how can institutions go about supporting the professionalization of doctoral supervision? How can they do that? Um, my suggestion would be we have to start by thinking what research supervision is. And there is a quote there from George Brown, Madeline Atkins, writing many, many years ago, which I think summarizes the whole thing beautifully. I'll leave you to read that. So you don't not just need to be research active. You do need to be research active. You don't just need that, but you also need the knowledge and skills to be an effective supervisor, which are forms of teaching. And so, following on from the logic of that, the institutions should be then support those engaged in this most complex and subtle form of teaching in the same way as we support people engaged in other forms of teaching. And there are basically four categories here in terms of professional development, in terms of incorporation and promotion criteria, in terms of awards for excellence, and in terms of external recognition. So, in terms of professional development, what this essentially involves are two things. One is the provision of initial professional development for people becoming supervisors for the first time. We have a lot of evidence which shows that people who are thrust straight into supervision tend to do one of two things, depending on their own experiences. If they had good experiences as a graduate student, they emulate their supervisors. If they had poor experiences, they revolt against it and do more or less the opposite. Well, neither of that is a particularly good approach to students and so on. So there's an argument that what we need is initial professional development to get people to surface their ideas about supervision and then to learn some of the pedagogy that will take it forward. And then the other thing, the biggest thorn of all in a way, is for experienced supervisors to have continuing professional development. As we've seen, research supervision is a fast-moving field. The sorts of things that were applicable even 7 or 8 years ago are not applicable now to the same extent. So there is a very strong argument that supervisors need to undertake professional development at relatively regular intervals. Now, I mean, just as one example, this is of initial professional development, the University of Alberta Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry. This is their graduate supervision workshop for new supervisors. And you can look at the objectives there. That looks to me like a really comprehensive introductory program for staff who are new to supervision. The second area is that of promotion criteria and how far your performance as a supervisor impacts your chances of promotion. I've actually just published a paper looking at this in the UK, and the evidence from the UK, I don't know of any comparable evidence from Canada or anywhere else for that matter, but in the UK, what was absolutely striking was yes, supervision was included in the promotion criteria from assistant professor to associate professor to full professor, but it was very much in terms of quantity rather than quality. In other words, you were promoted not because you were offering students a good experience, you were being promoted because you got enough of them through in the shortest time possible. And that's really a very, very bad guide because of the old adage, bad supervisors make good students. In other words, if a student does get through on time, there's no guarantee it's the supervisor. It could be they're just a very good student. So the question then is, do you have those promotion criteria involved? As I say, most UK institutions don't, but I've just looked as an example. This is from the Faculty of Science in the University of Calgary, where the criteria for promotion to associate or full professor on the teaching research focus or the teaching streams include formal and informal supervision, membership of supervisory committees and examination committees across within the faculty. So in that institution, there is an incentive there in terms of getting promotion because of your supervision. The third thing is awards for excellence. These are very common in terms of learning and teaching. Nearly all institutions have got them, awards for excellence in there as well. And the question is, I mean, can you take this into research supervision? I think the answer is yes. And I think actually quite a number of institutions in Canada have got awards for excellence to try to give some recognition to those who are outstanding supervision. And the one I've just chosen to look at here is from the University of Waterloo. And look at the criteria here. I personally think this is absolutely excellent practice because you've got the previous stuff, which is on how you get them through and all the rest of it. And then you've got the supervisor as a humanist mentor, as demonstrated by commitment to the welfare, provision of a caring atmosphere, creating environments where diverse students can thrive and be celebrated, willing to provide guidance that may not be related to academic matters and providing guidance relating to student career goals. I think that's a very good example of an award for excellence in supervision. I'm sorry to say we have these in many institutions in the UK, but an awful lot of them are student led and they end up being beauty contests. So we just nominate your supervisor without any criteria or anything to do so. Whereas I think awards like this are very serious and deserve a lot of praise. They're excellent. And then the final thing is in terms of external recognition, that can be through professional associations. I mean, a number of professional associations have got have organizational silos, if you like. They have groupings of supervisors within disciplines or sometimes across disciplines who will meet regularly, and there'll be a forum there as well. In the UK, we have the UK Council for Graduate Education Supervisor Recognition Programme, which offers you formal recognition of your supervision. You have to show that your practice is aligned to 10 criteria for good practice. And if you do that, you get the badge of recognition, which is becoming important. So I haven't found anything in the similar in Canada, but what I have found is that, for example, you can get publications here, and this is one taken from University Affairs. This was in 2023, and they had the spotlight on best supervision practice. And as you can see, there are a number of articles from supervisors on a wide range of topics there. Again, which it's a way of getting recognition for the supervision that you do. If I can jump to the conclusion, over the past 3 decades or so, hopefully we've shown doctoral supervision. It's been transformed from the master apprentice role. It's now a very sophisticated, highly professionalized form of teaching and supporting learning. But secondly, and it's not just the UK, many countries, this radical transformation has often remained unacknowledged by institutions. And so the case I'm trying to make is there is a need for institutions which have not yet done so to acknowledge the demands made of supervisors and then to offer them appropriate support, recognition, and reward. Now, hopefully, I've left enough time for any questions that you may have.
Lovely. And if that is your final slide,
That
thanks.
is
I
my
should
fine.
know this.
I promise you, yes, I
You
promise you.
no, and listen, we could listen to you forever, but I just want to see more of your face. So if it is your final, you can stop sharing. I do have some questions for you.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, look at that.
I just said this is my final slide. It's to
Lovely.
say thank you for putting up with me for the past hour and a bit, and just to say that for anybody, if you do have any queries, that's
Oh.
my email, and I'd be very pleased to hear from you.
All right, let's get to questions. I
Okay.
love
I will
that.
stop
I
sharing
want to
now.
go there. I want to go to your university. All right.
You don't.
Um, so lots of questions here. So there are
Okay.
some questions around what can universities do to support supervisors, but also to ensure that they remain accountable to their students. And of course, the reverse is true, that our students are to be accountable to the supervision journey. But this question is really about what can universities do to support supervisors to remain accountable to their students, especially in terms of the provision of timely feedback, adequate supervision, quality education. And it's noted again in one of your models, of course, that students are paying for this privilege. And so, what are your thoughts on that tough question?
I think one of the things that institutions can do is to establish registers of supervisors. And in doing so, those supervisors will be those who have undertaken the appropriate training programs, who have received reasonable evaluations from their research students, whether they be during candidacy or post candidacy. I essentially may well have contributed to graduate training programs or the administration of research degrees, whatever else, and so on. And many institutions, particularly actually in Australia, they maintain these registers. Now, if something goes badly wrong with a supervisor, one example I can give you is someone who had 3 research students, all of whom asked for a change of supervisor. And in this particular case, the matter was investigated, and the supervisor was told that they had to change their attitude. They would not be allowed to supervise for a period of, I think, 2 years. Yeah. And resumption of supervision would be on condition that
Uh,
they attended the appropriate training program and they were on probation thereafter. So I think institutions can do it that way. That's certainly one possibility.
okay. Yeah, and others are asking the same sort of question about this. I did wonder, I think we know, but what are your thoughts about professional development and supervision or even baseline training? What's your research told you about that?
Well, it's not just my research, but there's been research done in Australia, the UK, South Africa, France, Germany, etc., all of which suggest that supervisors who have undergone appropriate training um, tend to get tend to have students who are happier and who complete on time, whereas those who haven't been through such training, there is strong evidence that training, that surfacing what you think, that exposure to the pedagogies of supervision and the issues does impact on practice. There is actually solid evidence to support that. So I'm personally a great believer in supervisor development. Having said that, their preferred modes of it, I think that the best development of supervisors is talking to each other.
Yes.
Um, and certainly in my career developing supervisors, one of the great things I did working with department to improve their supervision, you identify their best supervisors and you get them to give a presentation saying, this is how we do it. And to others within the department. And they discuss it, and it's a very powerful way of doing it, I think. So supervisors don't learn from books. I've written several. I'm sure no one's read them, but they tend to learn. They learn from each other. If you can put them in a situation where they're able to learn from each other, then you can magic can happen.
Love that. I'm looking for other questions from our audience. You can pop that in the Q&A. I'm looking for, I think I've answered or asked all of the ones so far, but I did want to ask you, you've mentioned a lot of the changes, and thanks for the Supervision in Canada 101 for all of us. It was super helpful and nice history. These changes that you mentioned that are taking place, what's the one thing that supervisors need to do differently now in their regular practice, given those
I
changes?
Yeah, I think for me the biggest issue is the increased diversity of the candidate population, because essentially the supervisor population is the same as the candidate population was 20 or 30 years ago. And it is now untypical of the modern candidate population. And it seems to me the crucial thing for supervisors is to be aware that their experiences, etc., are very different to
Mhm.
those of candidates today, and to be able to respond effectively to candidate diversity. That for me is the most important skill that they can have. Firstly, to recognize that they are now atypical compared to the candidate population. And then secondly, to know how to respect that candidate population and how to support them through the process. And that's really important. I mean, if you go back 30 years, I mean, there was an ethos at one point that doing a PhD had to be hard. It had to crush you. You had to suffer,
Oh, yes.
etc., etc. That was part of the ethos. You can't do that today. You can't, or you shouldn't be doing that today, because you're dealing with a different population with different values, different issues, etc., etc. And you've got to be much more nuanced, much more sensitive,
Mhm.
to people's needs. That for me is the biggest
Mhm.
adaptation that is required.
Mhm. Yeah, I think when supervisors think they're to create a mini me, they're already in trouble.
That's right.
They're already assumptive kind of thing. You've kind of mentioned it a little bit, but are there like certain skills that you would want supervisors to have now given these changes? What the one I'm thinking about is really being attuned to mental health concerns, but also knowing boundaries and where to refer versus trying to take that on. I am finding that mental health precarity is a factor in supervision. I'm wondering your thoughts. Some skills that you think supervisors need now that they weren't necessarily emphasized maybe 10 years ago.
Well, I think you've put your finger on a very important one there. That supervisors, they need to know the signs of mental health issues, well-being issues, etc. Firstly, secondly, if they have noticed the signs, they need to know how to approach sensitively
Mm,
to candidates.
mm,
Thirdly, they need to know the boundaries. Very few supervisors are qualified counselors. And I always say with supervisors that, I gave them the benefit of my experience. Don't give them the benefit of your experience. You've got to know when and where to signpost students. And those are three skills that don't necessarily come naturally. But I think the ability to notice, the ability to approach without upsetting people, and the ability to signpost. people to. Those are absolutely crucial.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just add, this is feeling like a conversation now. I hope that that's okay.
That's fine.
Yeah, that I'm hoping that supervisors actually have a skill around understanding their own capacity and when they are at capacity and not trying to be a superhero and take on too many students. That I'm wondering your thoughts on that.
I very much agree with that. The the position in the UK, which what I know best, was this was a Wild West. The institutions imposed as many research students as you would take. There's one case I know of in one institution where I worked where it was found a supervisor had got 53 research students,
Oh
all
my God.
international. That sort of thing. What's happened here certainly is a result of the codes of practice is that nearly all institutions have established limits on the numbers of supervisees that people can take. The mean limit is 6. So most universities will say you don't take on more than 6 candidates. You're not allowed to do that. That's not entirely true. I know some where they'll go up to 10. But
Hmm.
that's the maximum in the UK. I do think it's absolutely incumbent on whoever appoints supervisors to take into account workload in terms of the implication, because too many supervisees, you haven't got enough time for each of them. And then with all the other elements of modern academic life, which are in terms of teaching, learning, administration, service, etc., etc., etc. It's got to be very, very carefully weighted. Supervision needs to be in workload models, very much so,
Interesting.
very much
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, and there's another question in the chat, just again asking around what if supervisors are not stepping up in the way that they should be, and should there be repercussions? And um, I guess I also, so we've sort of talked a little bit about that. Um, for me, just for our audience, is I have found that sometimes what gets in the way is workload of supervisors, and if only we could try to assist around workload, then I find the majority of supervisors are able to sufficiently be there for their students. What are your thoughts on that, Stan?
Well, I agree entirely. I think you need to. I mean, many institutions will say students are entitled to X hours per year and a maximum number of students. That's one thing. The other thing I
Huh.
ought to add, I've done this myself a few times, is I sometimes think our students need educating about the fact that we do have other things in our lives than supervision. And I've run workshops for students saying, what's it like to be a supervisor? And trying to explain to them, that you've got these raft of other things pushing at you, as well as your supervisory responsibilities, and that their expectations have got to align with that. Happily, in many institutions, say in the UK, they'll say we allow, say, 50 hours per year per research student. Your maximum number is 6. Yeah. So that gives you
Mhm.
300 hours a year
Yeah,
on research supervision. And you can actually say to students, look, this is the allowance I've got. I've got to work within that because of
right.
other commitments, etc.
Yeah, and that would certainly help balance sort of supervisor well-being and
Yeah.
student well-being as well. Yeah. We have a question here around historical context of time limits for completion.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm wondering about that. There are what we're calling milestones, and we're inviting students to, you were saying U of T has a sort of a 6-year limit.
Yeah.
Um, you're the participant is wondering about your thoughts on time limits and if they serve a purpose in the development of the student or research, especially given the changing conditions of the PhD, etc., and people's lives, busy lives. Thoughts?
I think it's worth here looking at the difference between systems because in Canada you still have a 50% completion rate within 6 years. I think that's the last figure I saw, which is comparable to the rate across the border in the United States, but you'll find in most European countries, the within 3 or 4 years, you're looking at least 75% completion. Now that's in part structural because in Canada and the States, you've got a bigger tort component. Yeah,
Yes.
but it's in part because there aren't the same institutional pressures
Hmm.
to get people through. Now, my personal view, as one who took 6 years for his own doctorate, um, is I was told, well, I'm not sure you can do anything worthwhile in that sort of time, really. This is donkeys years ago. Uh, we've got what are we doing when we produce a doctorate? Are we producing a magnum opus that will stand us in good stead for the rest of our lives, which is what
Right.
I was told all those years ago? The modern doctorate is not like that. It's almost like an apprentice doing a piece to demonstrate they've got the skills.
It's a start. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So in a sense, we've got to change our notion of what the doctorate is and say that this is not, the end of your life's work. It's a very small beginning, and you'd
Lovely.
expect to take it on from there. So I think that's got to be a real culture change.
Yeah. I want to ask you one more question, and then I want to
Yeah.
have time to share with our participants some really cool upcoming things.
Okay.
We've talked about the value of professional development for supervisors, new, ongoing, continuing. We also believe strongly, at least at York University, that students should also have some degree of professional development around what is supervision, what's my role, how do I drive supervision, this sort of thing. But going back to the professional development for supervisors, could you name a couple of foundational basics that you think should be included? Maybe just two or three.
I think the crucial things are firstly establishing expectations right at the start and calibrating those expectations so that you and your student are both on the same page. A heck of a lot of the problems that occur
Sure.
um, with supervision are because a lack of understanding of expectations, and that can be exacerbated if you have students from different higher education cultures.
Okay.
As well, their expectation can be very, so. I think the really important thing is to nail that right at the start. That's and then the other thing to nail is the regularity and frequency of meetings. All the evidence we have suggests that students who meet regularly with their supervisors for a reasonable length of time are more likely to be happier, be successful, and their supervisors are more likely to be happier as well. So I think that's the second thing, to establish that and to stick with that as far as possible.
Stan, thank you for this. It feels like we've been rightly schooled around supervision. I feel it's been a privilege. You've talked about the changing landscape of doctoral education and the implications for supervision. You've talked to us about the traditional model of supervision and how it's changed and the implications then for supervisors. You talked about massification, diversification, McDonaldization, can't pronounce that, regulation, structuralization, capitalization. All in all, you've talked about the very heart of supervision, and that is that both members are really respected and they know their roles. And so, just on behalf of York University and the National Community of Practice on Supervision, thank you. And we don't want people to leave. We'd like to pass to Tracy Bula, who's going to talk to us about a few future events.
Just let me say thank you for the opportunity. Goodbye.
You stay. Thank you. It's been a privilege.